My name is Grace Kellerman, and I'm 31 years old. For the past 2 years, I've been living back in my childhood bedroom, the same one with the same faded curtains from high school, and in my parents' eyes, that made me exactly one thing: a freeloader. A grown woman who couldn't get her life together, eating their food, using their electricity, contributing nothing they could see. What they never bothered to ask, not once in 2 years, was why I'd really come home or what I'd actually been doing while they quietly decided I was worthless. That question was about to matter more than any of us expected. The dinner table was quiet except for the clink of forks against plates when my father set his fork down deliberately, the way he always did before saying something he'd clearly been rehearsing. "Your mother and I have been talking," he said, not looking at me directly, "and we think it's time you moved out. You're 31, Grace. You can't keep living off us like this." "Like a parasite," my mother added, not even glancing up from her plate, saying it so casually it took a second to register, like she was commenting on the weather instead of describing her own daughter. I set my glass down slowly, feeling the words land somewhere deep and familiar, a place that had absorbed versions of this same sentiment for months now, just never spoken quite this plainly. "We want you out by the weekend," my father continued. "It's time you stood on your own 2 feet." I looked between them, searching for some flicker of hesitation, some sign that they understood the weight of what they just said, and found none at all. I hadn't come home 2 years ago because my life had fallen apart, though I understood why it looked that way from the outside. My mother had been diagnosed with early-stage kidney disease 18 months before that, and between her dialysis appointments and my father's construction schedule, someone needed to be there consistently. Someone who could drive her to treatments and manage the growing pile of medical bills threatening to bury them both. I'd been working remotely in project management by then, flexible enough to make the move home without losing my income. So I did the math and made the obvious choice, the choice I assumed any daughter would make. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly my presence would get reframed. In the beginning, my mother introduced me to neighbors as the daughter who came home to help, pride evident in her voice. But somewhere around month 8, once the immediate crisis settled into a manageable routine, the story quietly shifted. I became the daughter still living at home, said with a faint apologetic edge at family gatherings, like my presence needed explaining away. My father stopped mentioning the money I contributed toward groceries and utilities altogether, and my mother started making small comments about girls my age who owned homes, who'd figured things out, comments dressed as observations that always landed exactly where they were aimed. Slowly, deliberately, my sacrifice had been rewritten into laziness, and I'd let it happen because correcting them felt smaller than the actual work of caring for my mother. My mother's sister, Aunt Deb, had come over for dinner that night, which meant my parents' disappointment now had an audience, and I understood immediately why the timing of this conversation wasn't an accident. "Tell Deb what you've been up to lately, Grace," my mother said, an edge of performance creeping into her voice. Or should I? Because from where I'm sitting, it's been a whole lot of nothing for 2 years. Aunt Deb offered a sympathetic, uncomfortable smile, the kind reserved for moments when you're not sure whose side to take. My father leaned back in his chair, warming to the audience now. "She works from her laptop in her pajamas most days. Doesn't even help with the yard work anymore. We practically run a hotel here." I felt the heat climb up my neck, thinking of every dialysis appointment I'd driven my mother to, every medical bill I'd quietly paid down using my own savings, every Saturday I'd spent researching specialists so my father wouldn't have to. None of that existed anymore in the story they were telling. "You should see her room," my mother added, turning fully toward her sister now. "An absolute mess. No motivation at all." I ran the calculation I always ran in moments like this, the one that told me defending myself out loud would only hand them the version of me they'd already decided was true. So I said nothing, and simply excused myself from the table. What none of them knew, sitting there so satisfied with their own narrative, was that 18 months ago, right after my mother's diagnosis, I'd sat across from a loan officer reviewing my parents' mortgage statements while they sat in a hospital waiting room, unaware of what I was actually doing on my lunch break. The medical bills had piled up faster than either of them realized, and buried in the financial chaos was a second mortgage they'd taken out years earlier that had ballooned into something they could no longer manage, one missed payment away from foreclosure. I'd used almost every dollar of my own savings, the money I'd been setting aside for a down payment on my own place, to pay off that second mortgage entirely. Then, working with a lawyer a college friend recommended, I'd refinance the primary mortgage under my name instead, qualifying easily with my steady income and clean credit, structuring it so the house itself, the actual deed, was legally mine. My parents made a modest monthly payment to me that I never called rent, framing it instead as helping with expenses, because I understood even then how they'd receive the full truth. I never told them the house was mine. I never told them how close they'd come to losing it entirely. I told myself I was protecting them from that fear, protecting my father's pride, protecting my mother during a health crisis that already felt like too much for one family to carry. I hadn't accounted for a scenario where the house I'd quietly saved would become the very thing they used to throw me out of it. My mother came downstairs when my father called her name, her expression shifting from irritation to confusion as I laid the folder of documents across the kitchen table, the same table where they'd called me a parasite 3 days earlier. 18 months ago, I said, keeping my voice steady, when Mom got sick, I found out you two were about to lose this house. There was a second mortgage neither of you mentioned, months behind, one missed payment away from foreclosure. My mother's face went pale, her eyes darting toward my father, who suddenly seemed very interested in the folder in front of him instead of meeting anyone's gaze. I paid off that second mortgage with my own savings, I continued. Then I refinanced the house under my name because my credit qualified and yours didn't anymore. This house, the one you told me to be out of by the weekend, has been legally mine for a year and a half. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming in the background. My father opened the folder with visibly shaking hands, flipping through pages until he reached the deed, his own name conspicuously absent from a document he'd once believed was still his. "This isn't possible," he said quietly, though his voice had lost all its earlier certainty. "It's very possible," I said. "You just never asked what I was actually doing while you were busy deciding I was a freeloader." My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her earlier composure completely gone now, replaced by something closer to horror as the full weight of what she'd said at dinner settled over her. "Grace, we didn't know," she said, her voice thin and shaking. "If we'd known, we never would have." "Called me a parasite?" I finished for her, my tone calm but no longer soft, no longer careful for their comfort. "Told me to pack my things by the weekend? You didn't need to know I owned the house to treat me with basic respect. You just decided I wasn't contributing anything. And it was easier to believe that than to actually look at what I was doing for this family." My father closed the folder slowly, his jaw tight, guilt and shock warring plainly across his face. "We were wrong," he said quietly, the closest thing to an apology he seemed capable of forming in that moment. "We should have asked instead of assumed." "You should have," I agreed. "For 2 years, actually, not just this week." Aunt Deb's earlier presence at that dinner table felt suddenly very far away, replaced by a silence that belonged only to the three of us now. And for the first time since this conversation began, I felt entirely, unshakably in control of what happened next. I let the silence settle for a long moment before I spoke again, watching both of them wait, actually wait, for what I would decide rather than what they would tell me to do. "I'm not selling the house," I said finally. "And I'm not leaving it either. Not this weekend, not because you told me to. But things are going to look different now." I laid out new terms plainly, an actual lease agreement, a fair monthly payment reflecting what they could manage, clear boundaries around how they spoke to me and about me, in my own home. My mother nodded quickly, eager to agree to anything that might undo the damage of that dinner. My father took longer, but eventually nodded too, quieter, more thoughtful than I'd seen him in months. I didn't need their gratitude. I didn't even need their apology to feel complete, though it helped. What I needed was for them to understand, fully and permanently, that my worth in that house had never depended on their approval of it. Walking back up to my room that evening, the same bedroom with the same faded curtains, I felt something I hadn't felt there in 2 years. It finally, entirely, belonged to me. That night, lying in the room I'd grown up in, now legally mine in every sense that mattered, I thought about how easily people decide what you're worth when they've never bothered to ask what you've actually given. My parents had spent 2 years building a story about my laziness on top of a foundation I was quietly holding together with my own hands. I understand now that being underestimated by the people who owe you the most doesn't erase what you've actually done. It just means the truth is waiting for the right moment to stand up for itself. If your own family has ever looked at your sacrifice and called it nothing, you already know exactly how it feels when the truth finally speaks for itself, calmly, completely, and on your own terms.